To all our viewers from the United States, Korea, and around the world, welcome to Global Money Talk by Sampro TV, live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I'm your host, Remy Blaire, and you're watching our live broadcast from the financial capital of the nation in New York City. And we'll begin the hour with the market briefing, as well as live coverage of the U.S. markets. And for the market briefing today, we have Tai Wong, independent proprietary trader. Additionally, today we'll have Richard Bayles, co-founder and portfolio manager of Karani Asset Management, for a discussion on the obesity drug market. But first and foremost, Tai, good morning. Great to have you here today.
Good morning. It's always good to be here.
Well, first and foremost, let's start out by looking at the major U.S. stock averages.
Yes.
We started out in positive territory, but now we're seeing the Dow Jones Industrial Average down by about 0.5% on the session. And interestingly enough, we are seeing financials as the laggards this morning. And when we look at the other equity averages, the NASDAQ Composite Index is slightly higher on the session, up by about 0.2%. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 is nearly unchanged on the session after a flat open. So, Tai, I want to start out by looking at the Dow Industrials. What do you make of what we're seeing in terms of today's weakness following yesterday's rally?
It's still early in the session. The S&P 500 actually had, a very nice rally, not taking back all of its losses from Friday, but it was a good session, and really interesting to see where we end up today. The thing that's raising people's eyebrows this morning is how the financials are reacting. I mean, we're looking at J.P. Morgan. It's been down 6%. That's a pretty hard smack. Goldman Sachs, which, by the way, rang the bell here a little while ago, is down 4%.
Yes.
Some wag might say it's because they rang the bell. But it seems to be a larger problem with the financials, and there's whispers that saying it might be due to Ali Financial, which is down 15 or 16% when I last checked, and it was because they reported that some of their consumers were coming under duress, and I guess that sort of made the financials, make traders climb a wall of worry, saying that if loss provisions may have to grow. If this goes through some of the other larger banks. I mean, Ali is a regional, so it's interesting to see how. I'm interested to see how the financials do the rest of the day. I mean, actually, there was good news overnight for the financials, because the Fed came out with the proposal saying they're only raising capital requirements 9%, and that's down nearly half from what the original plan was going to be after substantial lobbying by the banks. And I'm sure Senator Elizabeth Warren will be very, very unhappy about that, and will give Chair Powell a hard time at the next Humphrey Hawkins or semi-annual testimony. But it's good for the banks. I mean, I do think. I mean, I worked for banks for a long time. I think they're a lot safer than they were before, specifically with funding. Now, Lehman went under functionally because they couldn't roll their funding. They had funding coming up on a Monday and they couldn't roll it. But now they make banks have funding a month ahead, 3 months ahead, even a year ahead. So the system, I do believe, is a lot safer. But this is definitely good news for banks, which is why it's so unusual that they're down so much and they're sort of dragging the S&P down to flat. Otherwise, I think the S&P would be a little bit higher.
And Tai, as you mentioned, J.P. Morgan is down 6% in New York morning trade, followed by Goldman Sachs and American Express, both down by around 3% this morning, and they are weighing on the Dow Jones Industrial Average this morning. And of course, as we look ahead to not just today, but tomorrow, we're going to be paying attention to inflation figures that are coming out. So within less than 12 hours, we do have the U.S. presidential debate taking place, but less than 24 hours, we get the first of 2 inflation data points this week here in the U.S. Tomorrow morning, we get CPI figures followed by PPI. So, of course, we know that the Federal Reserve will be watching these numbers closely. And given the recent market volatility, we'll have to keep an eye on what happens tomorrow morning.
Absolutely. It's the Federal Reserve meeting starts tomorrow, and it's a 2-day. They're all 2-day meetings now. Starts tomorrow and ends on Wednesday. And they will certainly be looking at that number. I think the market is pretty 70-75% set based on sort of the CME's Fed Watch tool that it's going to be 25 basis points. Unless CPI comes in, I think, very soft, I don't think that's going to change. I think 25 is pretty much set now. But if you get a very weak CPI reading, there's a possibility we could see 50. Certainly, the markets might react that way. But it seems a little unlikely. But certainly, the market and the Fed will be watching it very, very closely. And then on Wednesday, the PPI gives us an idea, what's in the pipeline, and sort of pipeline is sort of important as well. But PPI has been generally relatively soft compared to CPI.
And as you mentioned, the Fed Reserve will be watching these numbers closely, especially on the heels of that mixed U.S. jobs report that came out Friday.
That's right.
And of course, given that the Fed Reserve meeting will be taking place on the 17th to the 18th, with that rate announcement coming on the 18th, we will have to keep in mind that there's a blackout period for media in terms of Fed officials speaking, so we won't be hearing any Fed speak for the coming week.
That's right. I think the blackout period started last Friday, and the last comments were, I think, Governor Waller was open to rate cuts, which is important because he's been seen as sort of a weather vane for the Federal Reserve. But I do think it's 25 because I think 50 for them would communicate something they don't want to communicate, that essentially they were a little late. I don't think they want to give the market that sense. And they also don't want to panic the markets.
And speaking of the markets, Tai, I do want to take a look at what's moving the Dow, but in particular, we're seeing Apple shares today down by about 0.7%, and that does come after their event yesterday, which took place in California, so the Glow Time event. And, Tai, you and I were talking about smartphones ahead of today's show. I have an iPhone, and you do not. So what did you make of some of the announcements that came out from the event?
So I think Apple is the most active shares today. About 18 million shares have already traded. And I think overall, the market was underwhelmed. But I think the market didn't expect to get their socks knocked off, so which is why you had a relatively, so I think they might have been down a little bit yesterday, Apple. The iPhone 16 is nice, has a really good battery, has a special camera button, and I suppose my kids' generation would say, oh, this is really important if there's a special camera button. I can take pictures faster. But it was really, nothing really new. As a matter of fact, the most interesting things might be the AirPods, which have a hearing aid potentially built into them pending regulatory approval. So that's interesting, and you can say, I don't know what the overlap between people who wear AirPods Pros are and who need hearing aids, but it's certainly a step towards more health-related health-related features that they're putting into their products. And I think there's a sleep apnea feature on the Apple Watch. So but it's all incremental steps. And the pricing was considered sort of decent. So, but the market not that impressed. What I did find really interesting was that Huawei, whose products are not sold in the United States, just an hour or so after the debut of the Apple products, showed their new tri-fold phone, and that's 3 folds. It's priced at $2,800. Now, I have a folding phone. It's a Android Samsung, and I love it because I read on it all the time, and it's great. And I would love to have a tri-fold phone. I know like Google has a folding phone. I suppose Apple someday might come out with it. I don't think I want to do it with the first generation, but the folding phone is actually great.
Well, you brought up a lot of important points there, Tai, because when it comes to phones, at least for myself, I have not ever used a bifold or trifold phone, so that concept is a little foreign to me, but the last time I upgraded was many years ago, and we're thinking about consumers out there, both in the US as well as overseas, and most consumers are holding on to their iPhones longer now, and I think that speaks to the purchasing power of consumers out there. And when we look at that trifold phone from Huawei, I understand that the price point is $2,800 US dollars.
That's a
That is
lot.
expensive.
I think it's going. Maybe it might be a status item in China. I mean, the Chinese economy is struggling.
Yes.
But I think this was a lot of it was a one-up where this is the first tried fold phone. It's even Samsung, who's done really well with that, hasn't done it. So I think it's important to show that for China to show that we're at the cutting edge of innovation.
And when it comes to smartphones, I do have to say that when I first switched to the Apple iPhone, I was on a BlackBerry, and I was one of the last holdouts because I just got so used to that actual keyboard on the phone that I couldn't move away from it for the longest time.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see when it comes to adoption for that Huawei phone. And before we move away from Apple's event, I do want to address what you mentioned about the AirPods and the Apple Watch. So personally, I recently did make purchases of those AirPods in addition to a watch, and I think I should have waited a little bit longer since prices do tend to come down after these launch events. But it's interesting because when we take a look at purchasing power, right, for items that are being introduced, the sound that you mentioned for those AirPods, it does seem as though they're trying to capture an older demographic. What do you think about that?
Well, to your point, the older demographic, is the richest demographic, and they can afford to buy more things. And if it's something that's going to improve their quality of life, if you own a decent pair of headphones or a headset, and you're saying, wow, this can actually give me hearing aid capability. It's kind of something that you might not consider otherwise, which is, I think, a pretty smart move. And I don't use AirPods, my kids do, and the sound is great, the microphone is great, and as a matter of fact, I have to say that when we had a call with one of my kids who were away at college, I said to the other kid, give me one headphone and you use the other, and we could both hear very, very well. So, I mean, it is great product, is really, really well designed, but the market, is... they move incrementally. I love to see what the next big innovation is going to be. And you do have to remember that Apple is an unbelievable company. Their total revenue last year was something like $400 billion. That's Denmark or the Philippines, which is quite remarkable. And their profit on that's $100 billion. So.
Yeah, that is considerable, and we're not talking millions, we're talking about billions. And I think one last aspect that I do want to cover from that Glow Time event is Apple Intelligence, right? This is their artificial intelligence technology. And because you mentioned some of the revenue, Tai, we have to look at the European market, which accounts for about a quarter of Apple's revenue. And when we're talking about entry of Apple Intelligence into countries like China or areas or regions like the EU, we have to think about regulation and regulatory hurdles out there. So how do you think Apple is going to address some of these given the competitors out there?
Their artificial intelligence function is forthcoming. They say it'll be ready sometime in October with probably another iOS release or something of that nature after the first home ship. But they've had to be a lot more careful in Europe because Europe is much more regulation heavy. As a matter of fact, it just came out that the European Court of Justice made Apple pay $14 billion in sort of back taxes to Ireland because the Irish charged them too little. And this is a case been going on for the better part for probably a decade. So I think they're very, very careful about it. They'll have to tailor their offering depending on where they are. And I think this is true of a fair number of companies, but particularly the tech companies.
And as you mentioned, Google and Apple were both hit in billion-dollar European crackdowns when it comes to taxes as well as antitrust. And in addition to that, since you mentioned China, I do want to talk about China's economy now, especially given what we're seeing in deflation. So where are your concerns?
So China's travails, and if we could get graphic number 1 up on the screen. This is from Bloomberg. It's the China's economy-wide prices. This is what they call the GDP deflator. So they're measuring all the prices in goods and services from one quarter to another. And if you look at the right-hand side of that chart, you'll see that the GDP deflator has gone down for 5 straight quarters. and that's the worst since the financial crisis. There was barely a blip after the after the Asian currency crisis in the late 90s. There was only 2 quarters of lower prices during the financial crisis because they did a lot of stimulus very, very fast. That's been credited with helping the world economy. But this time, they're struggling. And the scary thing about deflation is the consumer might think that lower prices is good, but lower prices overall in an economy is actually quite risky because it makes businesses think, oh my goodness, prices are going down, so my profit is going to be less in the future, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back on spending. I'm going to start laying off workers. So it becomes sort of a vicious cycle, and they're struggling to fix that. And one part of the reason is with the current government in Peking, they have put on a lot of new regulation over the years that have sort of what I like to say has really crushed the animal spirits of the Chinese economy. Animal spirits is a term that economist John Maynard Keynes came up with, and basically it means sort of the spirit and the strength and the innovation of the economy. But when there's been a lot more regulation, a lot more government interference in private companies, it tamps down those animal spirits, and once they're gone, they can be hard to wake up again. So they're really struggling in terms of their economy. And you can see one of the impacts is you can see that oil is making new lows every day. New lows every day because of demand from China is expected to drop. You can see that in base metals, where copper, aluminum, and metals like that, where China uses literally 50% of the world's output. So because China doesn't have its house in order, it's actually impacting a lot of commodities.
Yeah, speaking of commodities, there in today's trading session, we are seeing front-month crude oil futures, WTI, that is below the $70 a barrel mark, and it is off by nearly 4% on the session. And very quickly, before we move away from China on the heels of your latest report, there are headlines that the PBOC's China bonds are seeing a trading surge and China's yields are smashing through record lows. So we've been keeping an eye on treasuries here in the U.S. as well as overseas. So what do you make of that?
So that's something they don't want to see. So I think the benchmark bonds and maybe it's the 10-year bond in China, the yield's only just over 2%. So if people are buying bonds, driving yields even lower, it says that there's very little confidence in the economy, confidence that the authorities will do what it needs to sort of get the economy going again. So that's a signal that they don't want to see. They haven't been willing to put out the stimulus that they did after the Great Recession, but at some stage, I think it is likely they will have to do something. And when they do it, they will do it. They have tremendous political will. They may do it very, very effectively, but we just don't know when. And the market could be forcing them closer to that.
And while we're on the topic of yields, very briefly, I do want to ask you about this because when it comes to yields and the recession indicators in terms of the yield curve, the inversion that we saw, I do want to briefly touch on that, especially on the heels of that discussion that we had last week in terms of the SOM indicator, Claudia SOM's recession indicator. So what did you make of that action that we saw in terms of the yield curve?
So the yield curve, has recently disinverted, and there's a lot of discussion on what does that mean. Now we have a sort of a normal yield curve now, where you have to pay, yields are higher further along, which you should normally be because of the risk involved. But if you look at sort of recessions, the last six disinversions, when the yield curve has done that, it's all over the map. The last 3 times, it signaled a recession, but in the 1980s, after the yield curve disinverted, you saw significant rallies in the S&P 500. If you look at that as a signal, of how well the economy is doing. So as a matter of fact, the dispersion is wide. We don't know.
And very quickly, Tai, since we're heading close to the 11:30 hour, I do want to touch on something that we're watching very closely, and that is the U.S. presidential debate taking place this evening, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So we'll get to hear from both candidates, Trump and Harris. So what are you expecting, and what do you think really matters when it comes to Wall Street?
Well, first of all, I'm getting my popcorn and soda, and I'm going to be right on the sofa for however long it goes, an hour and a half or whatever it happens to be. I think most people think that it will probably, given both of the candidates, will be style over substance, and this is, and the election is very, very close. I think we've seen the big bounce that that Vice President Harris got retreat a bit, and now it looks like that Trump, may be a little bit ahead, very, very close. This is going to matter. Now, how tradable is this? That's a good question. A lot of people, people have looked at the Trump trade, which faded after Vice President Harris replaced President Biden on the ticket. So I think, well, first of all, it's late in the evening, so there, for most retail investors, at least in the United States, it's a little hard to trade. But I think the one place for me is the difference between the two candidates is regulation. I think you're almost certain to get a lot less regulation with under a Trump administration than under a Harris administration. And I think taxes also matter. I think taxes will stay where they are. I'm not sure there's appetite in Congress to cut taxes any further unless there's a big GOP sweep. And similarly, I think taxes could edge higher, especially if the Trump tax cuts expire under a Harris administration. So how would you trade that? I suppose you could look and trade S&P futures, that if Trump looks like he's doing very well, or has done very well, that futures may rally on that. But for some of our other viewers, if you can bring up graphic 2, if you look at graphic 2 is a picture of Bitcoin in the red line, and the S&P 500, which is in the blue line. You can see the Bitcoin has been tracking the S&P very, very closely. As a practical matter, it's not a safe haven. It is really now a risk asset. So you could, if you were so inclined, have your finger on your Bitcoin trading button, depending on who's doing better. But personally, I think I'm going to just sit, watch, enjoy my popcorn, and really try to get a sense of where the direction of the debate is going. I think it will be actually a very interesting debate, and I suspect, depending on how it goes, it may be the final one. If neither side gets an advantage, neither side may want to risk it again. So it may be the only debate. It wouldn't surprise me at all. So this is it'll be exciting. Different ways to trade it. I mean, other people have suggested that, and Goldman Sachs has come out with a Trump basket and a Harris basket. Most people think that under a Harris administration, things like electric vehicles, like solar, will do quite a bit better. But under Trump, defense might be better, as well as defense might be better, and crypto, because he recently become a big fan of crypto. So I do think it will be a little difficult to trade, but if you were so inclined, I think you could do that.
Well, you hit on a lot of important points there, Tai, ahead of tonight's debate. And I think even the conditions for this actual debate, there's no audience, and both of the candidates are under strict mic rules, right? When one candidate is speaking, then they'll mute the other candidate's mic. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. And you brought up Bitcoin. So in terms of campaign financing, it's been very interesting to watch how some of these companies have been funding these candidates, and we'll have to wait and see whether or not we get any statements from either candidate regarding crypto. But we did get Harris put her economic policy out there, so it'll be very interesting to see how this affects the markets and how this debate unfolds.
Yes, absolutely. The mic rules are sort of interesting because, and I think it may actually benefit the president, because he sometimes can be his own worst enemy. I mean, he delivers zingers probably better than anyone else, but sometimes it's just a little too much. And I think if he's smart, he talks about policy, he talks about what's happened in the past few years, especially with the border, which I think is his strongest suit, and stays away from the name calling and the identity stuff that won't play well.
And so many issues that we'll have to pay attention to when it comes to the debate. So, Tai, I'm sure you and I will be talking about it on Wednesday,
Absolutely.
Especially after inflation figures tomorrow morning.
Yes, we'll talk about inflation, then we'll discuss the debate. Can't wait.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me, Tai.
Yes.
And coming up, I will be joined by Richard Bayles, the co-founder as well as portfolio manager of Karani Asset Management. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Global Market Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. I'm joined by Richard Bayles, co-founder and portfolio manager of Karani Asset Management, for a discussion on the GLP-1 obesity drug market. Prior to co-founding Karani Asset Management, Richard had a distinguished career on Wall Street at firms including Rockefeller, U.S. Trust Company, and First Manhattan. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Nice to be here.
Well, first and foremost, let's talk about obesity drugs. We hear about them when we're talking about pharmaceutical companies, regulation, and what's moving the market. So this is a very interesting topic. Since the FDA approved the use of semaglutide as obesity drugs, tell me what's happened and tell me about this burgeoning market.
Okay. GLP-1s were created to treat diabetes. They are a culmination of a long line of developments that began probably 30 years ago, when it was discovered that if you really control the level of blood sugar, glucose in the blood, you will lead to taking care of diabetes. It turns out GLP-1s have two important processes. They make the brain think that you are full, that you're not hungry. It blocks hunger, and it makes the gut think that you're full, even though you're not, relative to what you had been.
Okay.
This was almost an accident. So the first couple of GLP-1s simply were to treat diabetes, and they had this effect. And so first Novo Nordisk and then Eli Lilly developed commercial products that took advantage of the weight loss, which for Novo could have been 20% and Lilly has been even higher. And that's a terrific thing, because controlling obesity is a way to significantly better health.
And can you give our viewing audience an idea of what we're talking about when it comes to levels of obesity across the world, first starting out with the U.S.?
Okay. It may be as much as 10% of the world population, and much greater in developed world countries. It's hard to get obese if you're herding cattle out on the savannah. It's pretty easy if you're sitting behind a desk, walking to a commute, walking home, not doing much, and eating whatever you like. As in diabetes, people like, as a gross generalization, but pretty true, people like fat and sugar and, to some extent, protein. Think of what you have for a celebration. I'm going to have a steak, and then I'm going to have birthday cake. Fat and sweet. And if you're not exercising, that's going to pile up, and you're going to get heavier and heavier. And one of the first indications, aside from the way you look, will possibly be some disruption in your blood glucose, which will stop your body from processing sugar properly. There's another kind of diabetes which we can deal with and just leave aside, and that's type 1 diabetes. It's called juvenile onset diabetes. You inherit that. And it's quite different. It's an autoimmune disease, and for the treatment of that, the best, so far, thing to do is to augment the insulin that your body doesn't make. Fine, set that aside. The big deal is type 2 diabetes, which comes from this imbalance in your blood sugar.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to make that distinction between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Right. And when you think about consumption of food, as you mentioned, when you're going to a celebration, you might eat products that are meat heavy, carb heavy, sugar loaded, and even top it off with a beverage that is loaded with sugar or even alcohol. So
even alcohol.
Yeah, and that does add up to calories in total. So when we look at obesity drugs out there, we might think of some key commercial names such as Ozempic or Wegovy, Mounjaro, but now we're also seeing the development of over-the-counter drugs as well. But before we get to that, I do want to talk about this obesity drug market opportunity. So for viewers out there, give us an idea of the size of this market.
Okay. There are about 8 billion people in the world. Something approaching 600 million have some form of diabetes, which is a significant fraction, and it has grown over the years, in part because we exercise less and eat more. We exercise less decently, and we eat more of the wrong kind of stuff. And as countries get a little richer, that explodes. In more developed countries, there is a counter trend, which is to exercise. You see people running, and that's probably slowed the advance. But basically, in the world, close to 600 million people and growing. And that used to be a very significant and substantial and market for the companies, principally Lilly and Novo Nordisk, that make insulin. Now, the obesity question, perhaps as much as 10% of the population, 800 million, are obese. And it's growing, and it isn't simply in the developed world. If you stop walking to your farm and you stop cultivating your farm and you use a tractor or hire somebody else, you're not burning off the excess that is creating the imbalance in your blood sugar. And it's that imbalance in your blood sugar that's really important.
And also, when it comes to obesity, it does lead to other chronic diseases as well. So tell me a little bit about this.
Okay. If you abuse your body by having blood sugar or other substances, I'm not as aware of that, go up and down and essentially jerk you around, you're going to get sick. It's going to damage the mechanism where you absorb nutrients. It's going to damage your heart. It's going to damage your kidneys. It's going to damage your liver. And we don't know how much. We don't know how long this requires. And of course, it depends on the different individuals. There's an example on the chart of all of the different things that can be affected by essentially abusing your body.
And that is quite considerable. So I do want to ask you, when it comes to a disease like diabetes, there's still a lot of unanswered questions as well as unknowns. So what do we still not know about diabetes treatment?
Well, there's still a lot of things that there's a lot more things I don't know than science doesn't know. But it's still opening up. A lovely question to ask yourself. Why does a substance from the saliva of a Gila monster have the effect of lowering your brain's feeling of being hungry and lowering your gut's feel of being full? What's the connection? And by the way, who thinks of that? And the answer to that has some commercial importance. Who thinks of that are the people who are really, really, really studying that. They're working really hard to know, how does diabetes work? And they are reading broadly and learning about all sorts of different substances. And that's what led to first liraglutide for Novo Nordisk and then semaglutide.
And also, this is a huge market, as you mentioned.
Right.
So can you tell us why there aren't more players that have a solution ready?
Pigs. Diabetes was not treated medically until the 1920s. And two guys in Canada realized that you could extract insulin from dog pancreases, inject that into a person, and oh my gosh, their blood sugar's under better control. Pig pancreases, because the supply was greater and the affinity with humans was greater, took over. Two of the largest producers of pigs are Denmark and the Midwest of the United States. So Novo Nordisk in Denmark and Lilly in Indiana. So they got a very large step up because they had a great supply of raw material. And then they studied and they studied and they studied and they figured things out. And in the 80s, they came up with using genetic engineering to make yeast make insulin. Then they figured out in the late 90s when it became determined that, oh my gosh, you really need to control blood sugar levels. Well, the more we do that, we can use insulin analogs, pieces of insulin. We can use other products, and that other product set has led to what we now have for obesity.
And I think you've given us a great history of how these things came to be and a better understanding of how pigs fit into this equation here. So I understand that you've been following Novo since the late 80s and also owned shares of the company since the early 1980s. So I am sure that the company was a different company back then. So tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this industry in the first place.
Well, first off, they wrote great annual reports. There was a marvelous essay on various topics, whether it was genetic engineering or the absorption of sucrose, and it was fun to read their stuff. They had great pictures. But I got interested and got to know people there, and it was a much different company. I'll give you an example. In the late 80s, early 90s, I'm not clear on the details, they signed a deal with a major American pharmaceutical company to have this company distribute insulin in the United States. It was the biggest market and they really wanted some help. They thought, we're just little old Denmark and how are we going to conquer the world? And so we got some help from this big American company. It turns out the big American company had a heart drug that they really wanted to sell and was lots more profitable for them than being an agent selling insulin. So they used the calling card of diabetes to sell the heart drug, and it really didn't work out very well for Novo Nordisk. And so they realized, we're going to have to do this ourselves, and we can do it. I'll tell you a little story about the feeling inside the company. John F. Kennedy had a plaque on his desk when he was president. And the plaque should apply to the way Novo Nordisk, then Novo, felt about itself. And it was, oh Lord, the ocean is so broad and my boat is so small. And so they weren't successful as much as they could have been. They were fine in Europe, it was close. Getting into the U.S. market was tougher. That was principally the two developed markets.
And while we're talking about history, I understand that in your over 30 years of owning the stock, I'm sure there were times when you personally doubted the future potential of the company and wanted to sell. So give us a little bit of background on this.
Well, first I'll say I think one of the toughest things to do is to find a great business at a fair price. Everybody pretty much agrees on that. It's what Warren Buffett does routinely, or used to do routinely, and now claims he can't do it because he has to do too much in terms of size. But it's famous. That's difficult. It's almost equally difficult to hang on. Markets go up and down, things happen, you hear, oh my gosh, this joint venture about heart disease and insulin, it didn't work. Those guys are terrible, they're stupid, nothing's going to happen. At one point, Novo had a good manufacturing practices suit from the FDA. Why do you care about good manufacturing practices from the FDA? You can't sell your product in the United States, U.S. market without their approval. So there are always things being thrown up that could happen. At one point, fairly recently, it looked like, oh my gosh, we've pretty much run out the string on diabetes. There was no hint of obesity. Used to sell at a market multiple or less, now it sells at twice the market multiple. Maybe I should sell some. So it's difficult to hang on, and there are lots of reasons. Markets go up, markets go down, and hanging on is sometimes hard.
And when it comes to drugs like this, we hear about some of these side effects in the headlines and how this is affecting other industries as well. So when it comes to other industries, sometimes when we get earnings out from the pharmaceutical companies, we also hear about how it's affecting the CPG market, in particular here in the U.S. snack foods, right? So we're hearing about how this onset of consumers using drugs like this for obesity have shrunk their appetite and in turn their consumption. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, if a good segment of your sugar-loving customers are now taking something that makes them feel full and makes them feel like they're not hungry, that's going to hurt. Not going to hurt a lot. We're talking about 8 billion people in the world. We're talking about only 10% with diabetes or obesity. So it's not life-threatening to them. What's really important is the continued development of the products. Other companies have come into the market. Merck had a product, Sanofi has had products, Boehringer Ingelheim have had products, but they haven't had the consistent suite of products that Novo Nordisk and Lilly have had, because Novo Nordisk and Lilly have the history and the depth of knowledge and understanding. They have people whose careers have been dedicated to figuring this stuff out. And so it's a very strong competitive advantage.
So speaking of competitive advantage, when it comes to some of the competitors out there that you mentioned, what is, for the retail investor, if they're trying to decide if I want to invest in this space, how do I do that, and how do I go about comparing the different drugs out there? What should they be paying attention to? And also for consumers, given that you have decades of experience in this space, what is your word of advice?
Well, first off, consumers should be talking to their physicians and following the physician's advice, not some uninformed person on television. In terms of the commercial part of it, there's one thing that we look for in every business we follow and own, and that is a superior culture. It's hard to distill that to just one or two things, but I think principally if you think about the word respect, this is sort of the Aretha Franklin strategy. Does the CEO and do the leaders respect the people who work there? Do the people who work there respect the leaders? Does everyone respect their colleagues? Are people trying to cut corners and throw work on me, or not paying me adequately, or working me too hard? All of that stuff that goes into making a well-functioning culture. Among the things for Novo Nordisk is we're going to defeat diabetes. Sounds a little strange for a company that makes its living selling products to take care of diabetics. But if you really care about what you are doing and the work you're doing, that's pretty noble. And nobility is a very nice thing to have in a job. I often think I'm happiest when we're making money for somebody who's going to pay for their kids' college education. When the work we do, or work anyone does, is really going to be helpful. And that's true in many pharmaceutical companies. It's certainly true in Novo and Lilly. Second thing is, do they have the depth of knowledge that I referred to earlier? They've been studying this for a long time. Or did they just acquire somebody and they're hoping to develop what they just acquired? It's an okay commercial strategy, but it's not as solid. Merck, for example, has spent a lot of money doing that. And it's something to be hopeful about if you're a Merck shareholder, but it's not the same as understanding what Lilly's going to do in obesity. Lilly has the same problem because they are so rich, thanks to the success of the obesity and they just tore their cancer business apart. They got rid of a whole bunch of things, and they a few years ago started over because they could. So that leads to something that everybody should think about when they buy a stock. What's the financial strength? Is the return on capital employed high? Do they generate excess cash? Do they have a lot of debt? You can't turn around in a closet if you have a lot of debt, whereas you're a lot more nimble if you'd have none. And so those are three of the elements. What's the culture? What's the knowledge? And what's the financial position? And if you take that even broader, the companies that have been dominating the market in the last 10, 20 years are companies where they earn a lot of cash. Just Microsoft can't help but earn a lot of cash. They depend on the intellectual capability of the engineers that write their software. Yes, market position is important and so on, but in order to stay where they are, they have to have a culture that incents people to work hard and develop new stuff. And then, of course, because of the nature of their business, they don't have any debt, they don't have any financial problems, they can do pretty much what they want to do. So if they want to decide to go spend a lot of money on AI, I could decide, I want to spend a lot of money on AI, but there isn't a bank in the world that's going to lend me the billions of dollars I need. Microsoft has it on their balance sheet. So those three things, the culture, the knowledge base, and that's much more important than it was, say, 100 years ago. U.S. Steel, when J.P. Morgan bought it from Carnegie, he said, geez, I thought Carnegie was a rich man. He only had a few $1 million. He only had physical assets. It depended on where they had their mills. How could they get raw material? And they could just grind up the people that worked there. You can't do that today. The people that work there are providing your product. It's not being smelted. It's not being dug out of the ground and brought to you. So, culture, knowledge, finance.
So you hit on those three pillars there, and I'm sure that you have been following this very closely and also forecasting growth. So when we're talking about the total addressable market and expectations from growth based on the current trajectory, what are we actually looking at here?
Well, it's huge, and nobody knows. Look, there's a potential side effect to the GLP-1s, and that I have no idea, and neither, frankly, does anybody else. But it turns out when you lose weight, you lose both fat and muscle. And if you lose a good deal of both fat and muscle, fine, you're in good shape, you've achieved what you wanted to achieve. Now you quit. And with any pharmaceutical product, compliance is just enormous.
Absolutely.
And so many people will take a weight loss drug, a GLP-1, and then stop. Well, what happens? Their weight goes back up. But the weight that goes back up is more fat than muscle. And so you could end up being rather weak with as much fat as you used to have, but now that's a bigger proportion. So that's a huge possible flaw. And there are companies working on that. Can I tell you, one of them is Regeneron, which we also own. Can I tell you Regeneron's going to be successful with this? I have the word of the really brilliant scientific leader that we're working on it, and we think this is a big problem. Do I know he's right? Does he know he's right? He's hopeful. He thinks he's right. He's done much more analysis than I have. Since I'm a shareholder, I certainly hope he's right. But so there are a lot of things that can happen along the way that none of us knows why. Remember, this stuff comes from the saliva of a Gila monster. Who's going to think of that?
I know, and it's quite interesting that you brought that up. And I do want to ask you about some of the competitors that are out there, because when it comes to obesity drugs, a lot of us notice the headlines, right? Whether or not we're looking at the companies, we might see competitors offering alternatives, compounded alternatives that are over the counter, and that makes you question the safety as well as application. So whether we're talking about injectables or something that you can take in the form of a pill, what are the differences there?
The products that Lilly and Novo sell, they're the market now, have been approved by the FDA. If some clown tells you, I have a product that has been compounded and it's just like, but it's a lot cheaper, you can take a lot cheaper something into your body and Lord knows what it is. Nobody should go around trying to get medicine on the cheap and getting it from some place they don't know, hasn't been invested. That leads to another question, which is also important, and we've begun to see some regulation in the United States, and we've got regulation outside the United States on price. And that has to do with, oh my gosh, we're going to be bankrupted. The United States cannot afford to pay for the obesity drugs that will be necessary to get everything under control. That begs the question, can we really afford the 35% of the people who are obese getting heart attacks? Is that something we're willing to afford and we don't have to, we only have to pay for the treatment? How about the liver function? We don't even know the extent of that or the extent of kidney function, but we do know that avoiding those things is a heck of a lot better than getting them. Not just for the people who are having them, but for all of us who contribute to the insurance that pays for it.
Well, since you mentioned regulation as well as insurance, so we are sitting here just hours away from the U.S. presidential debate, and healthcare is always a key issue when it comes to campaign issues, in addition to the economy, because when we look at the healthcare system here in the U.S. compared to other developed nations, we know that there are issues and there are challenges. So for people out there who are taking these obesity drugs in order to lose weight, what does that look like in terms of the healthcare system here in the United States?
Well, those who are taking the proper drugs and are compliant with them are going to be healthier and are going to, in the long run, cost us less. That's my bedrock belief about that kind of thing. And I don't have much expertise beyond, any expertise beyond that. There are other models for drug purchase, for health care. We do know that ours doesn't work as well as it should. I'm really not the person to tell you that it's the fault of the drug companies, it's the fault of the insurance companies, it's the fault of the doctors, it's the fault of fill in the blank. That requires a lot more work than we've done to date. Our system developed sort of willy-nilly, not planned. The only reason healthcare insurance is a benefit in most companies is that in World War II, it was really hard to get workers, and you couldn't raise their pay. You weren't allowed to. There were price controls, wage controls. But you could give them health care, and it was free to them, and so people would change jobs for better. Well, that's the beginning of the system. That's really not the best plan. We'll do it because in wartime conditions it sort of worked.
And so you mentioned price control, so I do want to end with portion control here. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these CPG companies, you hear about how obesity drugs have been affecting purchases by consumers when it comes to their snack foods. So a lot of these companies are coming up with snack foods that are smaller, and this comes at a time when inflation has been a concern for consumers out there, right? And we've been seeing shrinkflation appear on supermarket store shelves. So a lot of things that we used to purchase, whether we're talking about liquid detergent or cereal or even a bag of potato chips, and we're paying the same price, but it's slightly smaller. So do you think some of these CPG companies that are trying to target people who have gone on obesity drugs, do you think that's a viable segment of the market?
Actually, I don't think they care much about the obesity question. They really care a lot about portion size because it's a way of raising the price. And if you have gone through a period, which we have, of significant inflation, your costs are higher than they used to be, and you got to maintain margins, you might follow that. But I wouldn't feel real badly if because of the beginnings of some real treatment for obesity and diabetes, people began to eat healthier. Wouldn't bother me a bit. And if I had to be what used to be Kellogg, I can't remember what it is now, and Procter & Gamble and others, and I had to take some of the sugar, some of the fat, some of the trans fat, and out of my product, that'd be all right with me.
And as people are living longer here in the U.S. and also around the world, we do need to keep in mind that health is very important as part of our lifestyle. So would you say that sticking to whole foods is the best advice you have when it comes to health?
My breakfast this morning was yogurt and muesli and some dried fruit. Thank you, Gretchen. I wouldn't have thought about it, my wife. I wouldn't have thought about it myself, but I'm pretty glad that that's what I had.
Well, I think you're very lucky that you have someone prepare your breakfast. I do have to say, as someone...
Oh, no, I didn't. She didn't prepare it.
Oh, okay.
Preparing it was a couple of tablespoons of this, a couple of tablespoons of that, and mix it up. I can do that.
Okay, so then you're saying whole grains, fresh fruit, probiotics in the form of...
Well, I don't know about probiotics, but I do know about low fat is a big help. I do know that fat is an enemy of good health. I do know that too much sugar is an enemy of good health. And I do know that it's really hard to get enough exercise to offset the standard American diet these days.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and weighing in on obesity drugs and also sharing a little bit about what you have for breakfast today.
There you go.
And as we head into the noon hour on this Tuesday morning, we'll do a quick market check and look at where the equity averages are trading. So right now we are seeing the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Let's try to bring up the chart here. We are still seeing the Dow Jones Industrial Average lower and off by triple digits or 0.8%. And as for the NASDAQ Composite Index, we are seeing it trade slightly higher, I believe, slightly lower on the session. We have turned lower as we approach the noon hour. And last but not least, let's take a quick look at the S&P 500 here. So for that index, we are seeing it lower as well. So all the major stock averages are in the red on this Tuesday morning. And that will do it for Global Money Talk live from the New York Stock Exchange. We're so excited to bring you daily coverage here on SAMPRO TV. You can check out the show anytime on our YouTube channel by searching Global Money Talk. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you back tomorrow morning. Have a great day.